To dehumanize Ukrainians, you have to portray them as, again, Nazis, as less human, so that Russian soldiers have no pity in deporting them, in arresting them, in torturing them.
Medieval crimes are being committed.
I come with clean hands.
Victims of horrific crimes want justice.
We don't have anything better than this.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg. This episode was produced in partnership with justiceinfo.net.
All rise.
Hi, Janet.
Hi, Steph.
We are in the middle of our little Ukraine season.
Yep, we've got plenty of interesting subjects still to cover.
And today we're looking at a possible set of crimes that might be dealt with at the International Criminal Court or in Ukraine itself or in universal jurisdiction case.
Yes, it's the triple trifecta. You know, it can hit everything.
We like it when it hits all the courts that we talk about. And it is...
hate speech in Ukraine. I'm sorry to sound so enthusiastic about it, because in fact it's Russian propaganda which tries to identify Ukraine as Nazi-run, as fascist, you know, that line that this is why the invasion was justified.
Yes, that's also the line that Ukraine is not really a nation, and these themes that we see, the fascist state theme and the Ukraine is not really a nation, is also what Russian soldiers seem to be repeating when they are there, and which is sometimes used as justification for some of the crimes that are committed there.
So to help explain this and provide some of the legal analysis, to tell us where the evidence is coming from, we've been joined by Ilya Nuzov. Hi, Ilya.
Hi, Janet.
And Ilya is the current head, the interim head of FIDH's International Justice Desk.
And we have Anna Vyshniakova, expert on speech crimes in Ukraine and head of Lingua Lexa. Hi.
Hi, Steph.
So, Anna, I think you've just actually come straight out of Ukraine here in The Hague. I wonder, you must have actually seen it yourself. What is this Russian propaganda like? How are Ukrainians getting to see these kinds of hate messages?
Thank you for this question, though it's quite a complicated question. First of all, I have to say that we started to face Russian propaganda not since the full-scale invasion and not since 2014, but far long time before. And also part of Ukrainian population has been also affected by that. For example, from my own experience working on the recently deoccupied territories of Kharkiv, we saw lots of newspapers, lots of books that have been replaced by the Russians, and that looks like absolutely horrendous. That looks like an absolutely different parallel reality where Ukraine is depicted like not a state, but part of Russia. And Ukrainian people are depicted not like the nation, the independent nation, but like small part of Russian people.
But you aren't saying that that depiction is actually hateful.
I would say that there are different layers of that. Russian propaganda is directed to put a person into a bubble. So this is kind of the system that has different layers of narratives, starting from kind of soft ones like, okay, Ukrainian people are our small brothers, not so smart, but we are coming to help them, and finishing by the total dehumanization, comparing Ukrainians with dogs or pigs.
And we saw when the full-scale invasion got underway, and we here in the West kind of got more sense of the kind of rhetoric that Russia is using, we saw for the first time that Nazi fascist regime story. Can you say what you think the strategy is behind Russia as painting it as Nazi or fascist, and what are like the historical implications of that for Russian-speaking audience? Because it will be understood differently in Russia, I think, than maybe here.
And differently in Ukraine, maybe.
Yes.
Well, Steph, that more aggressive Russian propaganda narrative started from 2014 after the Euromaidan, and they were trying to show that Euromaidan was not the, let's say, the thrive of Ukrainian culture and Ukrainian nation, but more like the Nazi upheaval. And that rhetoric started like to be more and more aggressive until the full-scale invasion, trying to justify it. And basically it's based on the full distortion of Ukrainian history, because probably the last, the hundreds of years, like Ukraine was trying to be independent from Russia, and now Russia is making the parallels between current struggle of Ukraine for its sovereignty and with the Nazi Germany of Second World War. So first of all, to enhance the mobilization of Russians, and secondly, to justify this horrible aggressive war.
When you had Euromaidan, I saw some of the rhetoric that they're trying to be pro-Western and being influenced by the West, but the fascist line is a very different one in my mind from the kind of European consumption where I sit. So why go for this fascist and harking back to Nazi Germany? What's the significance of that, do you think?
It's an interesting question, and basically I do not have the answer how to call a Nazi state Ukraine with the Jewish president, so I do not have the particular answer on their controversies.
Ilya, do you want to join in? Why do you think that this iconography or set of narratives specifically around Nazism and fascism is essentially what's been chosen by Moscow?
I think it's very important to understand the significance of the victory of the Soviet Union in the Second World War as an identity-building bloc of post-Soviet Russia. It has been used to consolidate Putin's regime's hold on power because Putin's regime has roots in the Soviet past. He is the former lieutenant of the KGB, so he comes from Soviet power structures. And there is not a lot of historic material in the Soviet past to draw on to legitimize the current political elites. And so the victory in the Second World War has been used to legitimize the political elites and to sort of rally the Russian people around the current political elites, drawing on the Soviet Union's history. And that's been used to drive both the domestic and foreign policy in Russia. And the reason why Ukraine is portrayed as a Nazi state is exactly to enable the use of the mobilizing potential of the victory in the Second World War. So by depicting Ukraine as a Nazi state, Russia is able to now say, look, we're conducting a liberation campaign in Ukraine, as we have done in the past with respect to Europe to liberate it from Nazi Germany. We are now going to liberate Ukraine from the Nazis that have taken over the state that has been traditionally within Russia's sphere of influence.
So you're basically harking back to the glory days of Russia just after the World War, when they helped defeat Nazism and had the Eastern Bloc and all that, and use that to mobilize to make Russia great again, if we borrow from another politician, essentially.
I think maybe we need to give a little bit of context. I mean, the reason why we managed to get you both here is because you're actually, FEDH is submitting what we call technically an Article 15. It's a submission to the Office of the Prosecutor at the ICC to say, hey, look, there's an interesting crime here. Take a look at this. But to do that, what I understand is that you've worked with quite a number of partners in Ukraine, done a lot of documentation, and presumably you've got actually some specific examples beyond that kind of big picture stuff of how hate speech is connected to what has gone on in terms of specific atrocities in the full-scale invasion. I don't know, I'm asking both of you at the same time. Who wants to take that one?
Let me jump in with one thing first. We keep referring to FEDH. It's, of course, the human rights organization called Fédération Internationale
Ligue des Droits de l'Homme.
Ligue des Droits de l'Homme.
We can just say droit humain.
Droit humain.
Go ahead, Ilya, you wanted to kick off with what you've been documenting.
Right. So this is an Article 15 submission drawing attention of the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to what we allege is a crime against humanity of persecution in the form of hate speech. And so we're saying that these Russian propagandists are targeting Ukrainians because they're those Ukrainians that don't want to be part of the Russian world. In other words, they don't want to be within Russia's sphere of influence or become part of Russia. They regard themselves as Ukrainian citizens who want to live in a democratic and free Ukraine.
We're going to come back on persecution a bit later on because, wow, there's a can of worms for us to discuss.
So to document these statements, what we literally did is watch the television programming and some of the radio broadcasts, analyze the statements made by these propagandists on Twitter, today X, or Telegram, a very popular social networking chain. So we've watched over 500 hours of this type of programming, but that's only a fraction of the actual materials that we analyzed. We then cooperated with the Ukraine War Archive, and that's an entity that maintains a platform where digital evidence and other evidence of atrocities committed by Russia's armed forces in Ukraine are stored and preserved. And they helped us to upload over 2,000 segments containing statements of different propagandists that we're targeting in this submission, and convert those segments into text files, which were then made searchable. And we came up with a list of keywords that enabled us to conduct quick searches and narrow down this extremely large pool of statements to those that are the most odious ones.
I'm very curious to know what these keywords then are. What do you search for to find?
What can you guess? Do you have Nazi, fascist?
Nazi, fascist. I guess you would put dogs in there, and I just said that they compare Ukrainians to dogs and pigs. I don't know. That seems like a catalog of horrors to me. When you looked at it and saw the evidence you collected, what were some of the phrases that most stuck with you as, I can't actually believe that they're saying this?
Well, we looked at several categories of statements. Some of those were direct calls to violence. And so we looked for any statements that contained the words destroy, annihilate, remove, detain, sequester. You get the idea. Then another set of words were pejoratives. So the words that aim to denigrate, insult, humiliate Ukrainians, such as the word Nazi, chachol, which is a pejorative term for Ukrainian, often used by Russians, Ukro-Nazi, which is sort of a neologism combining the term Ukrainian and Nazi, but then scum, vermin, Satanists, blisters, the worms. I mean, the list is very, very long. Another category of statements we looked at concerned falsifications of history and mirror accusations. And so we looked at statements that negated the Ukrainian identity, claimed that Russia and Ukraine are one state, that there is no Ukrainian statehood, and so forth. And accusations in mirror, as you know, Russia has accused Ukraine of committing genocide in eastern Ukraine. So they've also accused Ukrainians of trying to exterminate the Russian-speaking population in East Ukraine and Crimea, committing all kinds of atrocities. So some of the things that have stuck in my mind personally are statements made by this guy called Sergei Mardan, who is a radio personality who very casually offered to burn alive Nazis. But by Nazis, we need to understand that he meant regular Ukrainians who were just not willing to cooperate and collaborate with the occupying authority. He suggested creating gulags for teachers who refused to collaborate with the Russians in the Zaporizhia region. Margarita Simonyan is another very famous media personality who likes to invoke biblical references. So she suggests that, Ukrainians should be subjected to the 10 plagues of Egypt, including by submerging Ukraine into darkness, and hence calls to carry out attacks against infrastructure in Ukraine.
So that connects up with what we already know, that the ICC prosecutor has charged against some of the senior figures in the Russian armed forces.
Exactly. And that was important for us to draw on that connection to show that these statements were carried out as part and parcel of crimes against humanity that were being committed, and in connection with those other crimes, which are some of the legal requirements of the Rome Statute.
Were you also involved with documentation? Do you want to say a word on it?
First of all, congratulations to our colleagues with this submission. Basically, this documentation is an incredibly difficult work because it still involves the human resource, not just artificial intelligence, as we're trying to make this in Ukraine. And it's quite difficult to watch thousands of hours of Russian propaganda. Well, our organization is involved in documentation together with the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine.
Oh, so the Office of the Prosecutor, what are you doing there?
Well, we work together with the prosecutors and with the investigative authorities to investigate the crimes related to, let's call them speech crimes. Ukrainian Criminal Code has a full set of articles that are connected to the speech crime in the context of armed conflict, started from propaganda for war and including, for example, the calls to change the territory of Ukraine or to destroy its constitutional order. So basically, we need to say about the limited resources of the law enforcement system, and it definitely needs some assistance, let's call it like that. So it's very big set of information that we need to analyze, that we need to collect, we need to systematize it. Then goes the linguistic expertise as far as Ukrainian authorities are working with the international legal standards. So not just like that Ukraine takes the propagandists and try to put all of them into jail. So all of the statements go through the expertise. And only after that, Ukrainian authorities provide the notice of suspicions.
And are there already cases ongoing in Ukraine or notices served?
Of course, we already have even the indictments, and we have plenty of notices of suspicion that are published on the website of the Prosecutor General, so everyone can have a look there. And Russian propagandists can see that why they are accused, and that it's not the accusations against journalists, it's the accusation about propagandists.
Would these be trials in absentia if they come to fruition? Again, I mean, these people who are based in Russia.
For the current moment, yes. So the court proceeding against a couple of Russian propagandists have already been in absentia, and also the pre-trial investigation is also going in absentia. But we hope that these in absentia trials will have their result into the punishment.
You talked a little bit about the Ukraine prosecutor's office is looking at this, and there are hate speech or speech laws in Ukraine. Why then do you need the ICC and universal jurisdiction mechanisms for the hate crime? What bits do they need to pick out to kind of supplement the Ukrainian system, do you think?
Well, first of all, Ukrainian legislation is not perfect, and it's still not adopted to the, let's call them, standards of war. For example, what comes to incitement to genocide, we have just like a very small sanction, less than 5 years, that is not enabling us to make the in absentia prosecutions unless these crimes are not accompanied by the other crimes. Or, for example, we do not have the crime of persecution, and we do not have crimes against humanity. So that's where ICC can be complementary. Secondly, as I was previously telling, that we do not need to concentrate just on opening of criminal proceedings, but we also need to think about enabling the punishments, and that is the place where universal jurisdiction can come into place, and definitely has an effect because we can see that Russian propagandists are basically afraid of international arrest warrants, and in addition, Ukrainian system definitely needs international help in prosecution them.
Ilya, you spoke already about some of the evidence looking through these hours and hours, but there's also something that I'd seen mentioned in your submission to do with some confidential materials, things called talking points, known in Russian as temniki or metodichi. I'm sorry, I don't speak Russian, so I might have got the things wrong. Could you explain what those are and what use they might be for a potential ICC investigation?
So in addition to targeting the 5 propagandists for actually making the statements and disseminating this hate speech against Ukrainians, we're also targeting one politician who is a member of the presidential administration of the Russian Federation, Alexei Gromov. And he is allegedly in charge of traditional media. In other words, he is directing basically the major television channels what to say and what not to say. And there are some mechanisms on how to do that. One of those is what you refer to as temniki or metodichki. These are written guidance. They're talking points that are distributed to all of the heads of major media and then disseminated among the regular staff that provide instructions on how to cover the war, among other things. And they would literally say that you should refer to Ukrainians as Nazis, or we should cover certain events that are taking place in battlefield in a certain way and describe the atrocities committed by Ukro-Nazis. They're quite detailed. They're also aimed to inspire certain feelings, even in Russians. They will contain adjectives in the beginning of these talking points that will say pride, unity, or something like that. So upon hearing these news, the Russian audience will be compelled to feel these emotions that will help rally them behind Russia's armed forces and not feel any pity towards Ukrainians and enable the Russian soldiers to carry out those grave crimes that they are carrying out in Ukraine.
So in practical terms, me as a working journalist, at some point I would get on my desk or I'd get an email from my editor saying, I got word from the government, and this month we're going to focus on the gains of the Russian army and the incredibly respectful way in which we treat our POWs, which is the pride of the Russian nation. And then and this should be in your reporting. And then with that in mind, I make my stories? Or is it more you should do this story and here are the facts that we want you to put out?
Well, I'll just give you a couple of examples. So one of the talking points was about the annexation. The referendums were accompanied the annexation of Zaporizhia, Kherson.
So just a little background. After the full-scale invasion, Russia organized these referenda where people were supposedly free to choose whether they wanted to become part of Russia, where these countries would be fully integrated in Russia or not, and had supposedly free elections. Is that what you're referring to?
I'm exactly referring to this, but of course they were not free elections. They were forced to vote at gunpoint, with soldiers often walking around houses and literally telling people to go vote. So one of the instructions in the talking points was to say that the people in these occupied regions were waiting for Russia's armed forces. They're waiting for liberation of these territories from Nazis, and that now Russia is here to stay forever. This is a common refrain that they want repeated over and over again. Another example that really jarred me was talking points prepared to commemorate the day of baptism of Russia on 28th of July. And there was a very specific guidance there on how to portray Ukraine as an apostate entity that is satanic, that has adopted the values that Russia doesn't uphold, such as, gay marriage and these sorts of things. And it sort of draws comparisons between what Russia is doing now to the conversion of non-believers to Christian faith, and warns about the dangers of being controlled by Europe and being shaped into this Nazi state, which is not only menace to Russia, but to the entire world. And so Gromov, besides the talking points, also holds these weekly meetings called lituchki, which is just another word for a meeting where, again, all of the heads of major media gather, and then the oral instructions are also passed down. We are saying that by virtue of Gromov's effective control over these heads of media, by virtue of giving them instructions and telling them what to say and what not to say, he bears responsibility for the conduct of the propagandists themselves, either by ordering them to do so or by knowing that they're disseminating hate speech and failing to prevent it.
Ilya's described quite a few of the individuals that their submission to the ICC outlines. Are these the same kinds of individuals that Ukraine has been looking into, or are you looking at a different level or different types of people?
Well, as the investigations are ongoing, I cannot reveal all the names, obviously, but I have to say that international system can be complementary to Ukrainian system because it's also talking about the episodes. It's like I had the comparison. So, for example, if a person kills one person and then kills the second person, so you still can prosecute the person for the second murdering. So basically, this can be complementary. And of course, when we talk about propagandists, what Ilya just told, these are classical propagandists. But basically, the list of them is much bigger because not all of them are speaking on TV. For example, we can talk about the artists. There is also a newly emerged agenda. And again, Russian propaganda uses all the possible means like movies and even video games. So the list is literally endless, and there is lots of work that has to be done.
In your Article 15 communication that FPDH did, Ilya, you are focusing, beside Gromov, who is the politician, also on all these senior media figures. And, we're also journalists. So why are you
Why are you picking on us?
Why are you picking on the journalists in the sense? Like, I can see that this, the kind of speech that can be damaging. And we've seen propaganda and we've seen it in war crimes trials in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. But if you're looking for the most responsible people, would you not focus more on the politicians that drive this system?
We're just cogs. We're not in charge.
I mean, no, I don't want to suggest that, because there have been horrendous things looking at the Rwanda media trial.
Agreed, but how do you answer that suggestion?
Well, I would suggest first that we don't refer to them as journalists, as Anna had highlighted already. You're journalists, they're propagandists. And I think the distinction is that they don't report on facts objectively. They create facts, they manipulate facts, and they exaggerate facts in order to achieve certain objectives. At first, this objective was to portray Ukraine as a Nazi state, and that was to facilitate the annexation of Crimea. That was to facilitate the full-scale invasion of Ukraine as a campaign to denazify Ukraine. Then Russian political leadership saw that there are very few people that wanted to become a part of the Russian world in Ukraine, and yet there is a need to motivate the soldiers to cleanse the territories that they occupied from those Ukrainians that are disloyal to Russia. And how do you motivate these soldiers? Well, you have to dehumanize Ukrainians. You have to portray them as, again, Nazis, as less human, so that Russian soldiers have no pity in deporting them, in arresting them, in torturing them, in order to weed out those who are disloyal. We regard the speech, the hate speech, and the politicians who are shaping these narratives as part of the same hateful campaign. And we think that these media figures, they're not merely cogs in the system, but they actually have a lot of room for creativity. And because they wield so much authority among the Russian population, their main audience, they're perfectly aware of what they're doing. They're not merely anchors on some TV program. They host these shows where they invite guests and discuss all the issues around the war. So they are quite innovative and creative in preparing, delivering these messages, showing that this is a system. This is a premeditated campaign. So we believe that they're equally responsible as their political leadership in devising and implementing this campaign of hatred. And because they wield such an influence, they bear the responsibility as much as the political leaders. And I'd like to just focus for a little bit on the criteria that we use to select those speakers and their leadership roles within the presidential administration or within the media sphere is something that we considered, but also their place in the media, in other words, their recognizability. So the second criteria we considered is their recognizability. Some of these speakers, they have 2-3 million followers on Twitter or Telegram. Their programs are broadcast over main television channels, state-controlled television channels on Sunday night primetime. So they have a very large following. And it's important to also note that 2/3 of the Russian population still find their news on television. And so it's a very important medium. And these individuals are very important in shaping the minds of the Russian public.
I'm thinking back to some of the first trials that I watched, which were in Arusha, the Rwanda media trials, which were around incitement to genocide, from senior publisher. Actually, one journalist who was involved also gave evidence. I mean, there were all kinds of questions, because how on earth do you prove this? What do you need to prove? But I'm wondering what's different between trying to put a case together about incitement to genocide on the basis of propaganda and crimes against humanity persecution on the basis of propaganda. Oh my God, you could probably write a PhD on that. But yeah, what's your take?
We need your talking points in 2 minutes.
In 2 minutes only.
No.
I'll do my best. We're arguing that these are two distinct crimes and they require different elements and different evidence to prove them. Incitement to genocide entails incitement to destroy the group as such, in whole or in part, whilst persecution as a crime against humanity requires deprivation, severe and intentional deprivation of fundamental human rights with a discriminatory intent. So the actus reus, the material elements of the crime, are quite different. In putting this together, we had to prove that the speech acts as such amounted to a severe deprivation of human rights. And here we argued that they are deprivations of the right to dignity, security, and self-determination. And 2 out of the 3 of those had been previously relied upon by the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia to find the media and political figures in those cases guilty of crimes against humanity, of persecution. So we really had to show that this deprivation also occurs because Ukrainians who want to live in an independent Ukraine that follows a distinct political course from Russia are targeted just because they are Ukrainians who regard themselves as such.
And as an ICTY geek, I just want to mention for the followers that are interested, this ICTY case that Ilya is talking about is of Serb, we call him firebrand politician on the Reuters network usually, Vojislav Šešelj, who made disparaging comments about in Serbia. One of the questions we had while we're looking at this, and I read through some of the documentation, is why tease out hate speech to this level for Ukraine, because it's a very small element in persecution. And if you are going to have maybe a genocide or incitement to genocide case, you kind of have this idea that, the words can't hurt you. It's just words, when you tell your kids, like, they're just words, they can't hurt you. So why put all this effort into teasing out this little bit of persecution when you could go after large-scale detention, torture, sexual gender-based violence? We see all of that in large amounts in Ukraine. And this is maybe now I'm theorizing, but you could say it's relatively harmless. Some idiot shouting on TV, why do you care?
We believe that all of the crimes that you mentioned, they are accompanied by this rhetoric and enabled by this rhetoric. And hence, the role of hate speech is much larger than just a part of another episode of persecution. And it's really evident from the documentation work that our partners are carrying out. And maybe Anna can speak more about this, but there is evidence that shows that Russian soldiers are going around houses, occupied villages, and towns in Ukraine looking for Nazis. They're torturing Ukrainians, accusing them of being Nazis or Nazi collaborators. They're telling them that we're here to liberate you from Nazism. There's even one episode that we cite in our communication where a victim recalls seeing a truncheon in the corner of the room with the words denazification on it. So there is a lot of attention to the context in Ukraine, and there are a lot of organizations that are documenting the other crimes that you just described. And we're also working on some of those, including filtration practices, for instance, which also, in our view, amount to, well, at least preliminarily, amount to persecution. But we believe that all of them are enabled and accompanied by this rhetoric, which, together with that underlying context and those other acts that comprise crimes against humanity, amount to persecution, but also as a separate act as such, it is also a crime against humanity of persecution.
Anna, maybe you can pick up on this to finish off for us. When you hear Ilya describing its crimes against humanity persecution and the discussion about whether it would be incitement to genocide and so on, I'm wondering whether in Ukraine you're also thinking about all the other kinds of ways of defining this crime, or whether you're just sticking with what's in the criminal code.
Well, first of all, I would like to mention that there is not a hierarchy in the grave crime. So, like sometimes we hear it from journalists, like that genocide is father of all crimes and aggression is mother of all crimes.
We agree with you. We're with you on that.
Yeah, but
hashtag no atrocity Olympics.
Yeah, but when we talk as lawyers, we do not have any kind of gradation. So persecution is as a grave crime as incitement to genocide, basically. When we talk about Ukrainian level, level, so we can prosecute only those crimes that are prescribed by our Ukrainian criminal code, and that's why we need the ICC, because ICC is based on the principle of complementarity. And definitely it's a very big gap for Ukrainian criminal code, and probably another issue that Ukraine still didn't ratify the Rome Statute. And definitely we have lots of crimes against humanity ongoing in Ukraine.
Okay, thank you so much, Anna and Ilya, for joining us today. But we haven't finished yet. We have our regular questions that we ask at the end of the podcast that you can't prepare for. And the first one to either of you is there anything that you would have liked to have said that you haven't had a chance to say? Any particular thing that we forgot to ask you?
Well, I would be happy to say that now it's the chance for all the world to move the agenda of prosecuting and punishing the perpetrators that are related to the hate speech. Because since the times of Rwanda, the means and methods of disseminating of hate speech have definitely developed, and now hate speech became much more dangerous than it was 20 years ago, and since the time when the Convention Against Genocide was developed. So it's important to consider all the methods, including all the methods related to internet, like bot farms, like artificial intelligence, deep fakes, video games, and so on and so forth. And definitely law cannot be conservative when the world is going very, very fast.
Anything you would like to add, Ilya?
Well, I think I would have liked if you asked who actually drafted the communication, because you might be curious to know that all of the authors of this communication were Russia-born lawyers or linguists. And I think it's important for us because we're affiliated with the aggressor state. And for us, it's important to do our part in making sure that those that are responsible for grave crimes are brought to justice. And so this is our small contribution to that objective.
Noted. As absolute international law geeks, one of the other questions we have is, you are probably also very much into law things as both lawyers and researchers. Do you have a favorite case, a court case, something that you like to talk about, that you like to teach, something that inspired you to go in this field? It can be any of those, but is there some
It's often Tadic, those people.
Well, maybe one of my favorite cases is Jelicic case, because it's kind of very controversial. Let's say, first of all, what comes to the genocide. And secondly, I started to read more about this case after reading the book of wonderful Slavenka Drakulic, who was describing the ICTY prosecutions. And it's also the question how, let's say, a kind person became the manifestation of evil.
This is the case of Goran Jelicic, who was, I think his nickname was the Serbian Adolf, or he called himself the Serbian Adolf, and he would boast to journalists that he would shoot Bosnians before breakfast and that kind of thing. I saw his trial. It's one of the few people that I saw in the stand at the Yugoslav tribunal. When you look at him, you're like, this guy's a psychopath. He looked scary. And I saw a lot of people who did horrible things and were judged for horrible things at the ICTY, who looked like, the ordinary men. But Jelicic, you would, if you would meet him in the street, you would probably cross the road and go walk on the other side of the sidewalk. Something was wrong with that guy. Ilya.
Well, this may be very banal, but I'm going to go ahead and say that the Nuremberg Tribunal and the Nuremberg trials are something that inspires me, and especially in this work. And of course, I'll refer to the Julius Streicher case, who was convicted for crimes against humanity of persecution for having poisoned the minds of the German people with anti-Semitism, something that we very much can draw parallels with in analyzing the current case.
And Ilya, our last question for both of you is, what are you reading at the moment, or listening to, or watching? It can be connected to this world, or it can be what you use to get away from this world. Maybe it's what you read at night to your kids, or what's on your own nightstand. What would you like to recommend to our audience?
Well, I've been reading in preparation for this communication. I've been reading Jade McGlynn and her book called Memory Makers, which explains very well the use of the tropes like fascism and Nazi in the war of aggression of Russia in Ukraine. And I've been watching The Big Bang Theory recently. It's something that I've missed when I was spending my youth in the United States, but for some reason now I just find it such a pleasant comic relief from all the stress that we deal with on a daily basis, analyzing these types of cases.
Anna?
So first of all, I would like to recommend 2 books. Basically, one is that I have already mentioned is Slavenka Drakulic book, They Wouldn't Hurt a Fly. That, as I have already mentioned, is telling about the prosecution of the perpetrators in the ICTY. And the second is Atrocity Speech Law by Gregory Gordon. That is basically one of my favorite, well, if it's possible to say favorite book about hate speech, but if someone is interested about the law that regulates how to prosecute the alleged perpetrators for the hate speech crimes, that is that book that has to be read.
Thank you both so much. Thank you for taking the time to explain this to us and for giving such a nice, clear legal explanation of what you're doing, how you're doing, and with some I can't say amazing examples about hate speech either. That sounds like I'm condoning, I think. Mind-boggling examples of hate speech that we see.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg. This episode was produced in partnership with justiceinfo.net, an independent site covering justice effort for mass violence. This episode was recorded at the Hague Humanity Hub, home to a community of innovators in the field of peace, justice development, and humanitarian action. Music is by audionautics.com, and you can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.